In 1977, rancher Miguel Ortega and his family vanished from their ranch on the edge of Arizona's Superstition Mountains. None of them were ever found. The official report claimed they got lost and perished in the harsh desert, leaving behind a dilapidated ranch and starving livestock. The police quickly closed the case, the land was transferred, and the town gradually forgot the tragedy. But 40 years later, when an abandoned barn was opened, rusted branding irons stained with blood were discovered. This evidence contradicted the entire official story the community had believed for decades. What was found forced Elena Ortega, Miguel's granddaughter, to embark on a journey to reopen a case that powerful forces had tried to bury, proving that sometimes the deadliest secrets are hidden right beneath the familiar desert sand. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. In 1977, as Arizona's brutal heat lingered on the cracked earth, rancher Miguel Ortega's entire family disappeared from their ranch on the edge of the Superstition Mountains, leaving behind a haunting scene: over 40 emaciated cattle bellowing in their pens, empty water troughs, uncut hay wilting under the sun, and a wooden gate broken and swaying in the desert wind. The first neighbor to notice called the police, and within hours, the Ortega Ranch was surrounded by Pinal County Sheriff's vehicles, news cameras flashing relentlessly, while locals whispered in fear. The newspapers at the time reported simply, "The desert swallowed them," as if death or disappearance was the natural fate of anyone daring to defy this unforgiving land. No bodies were found, no clear signs of struggle or escape, only the dry silence and the vacant stares of cattle trampling the dust where a family's life once thrived. The case was quickly closed, labeled as missing in harsh conditions, and no one dared ask more. But that memory didn't die. It lay dormant in the red earth and searing winds of the superstition. 40 years later, in a forgotten, rotting barn, hikers stumbled upon something that chilled the community: rusted branding irons with dark, dried blood, nestled among decayed straw and broken ropes. That mute evidence whispered of the past, hinting that the Ortega family's disappearance was no simple accident. The news pulled Elena Ortega, Miguel's granddaughter, back to Arizona after years away. Raised on half-true stories about her grandfather, Elena had never had clear answers for her family's pain. Now, seeing photos of blood-stained branding irons in the local paper, she knew they weren't just rusted relics of the past, but a call. In the scorching winds of the Superstition, Elena stood before the abandoned ranch's barren ground, feeling the weight of her family's history on her shoulders, and vowed to follow the trail of that rusted blood to uncover the truth buried for 4 decades. The Pinal County Archives sat in the basement of an old administrative building, where towering iron cabinets were coated in dust thick enough to testify to time's neglect. Elena Ortega descended creaking wooden stairs, clutching a permit to access the records, her heart pounding at the thought of the name that had haunted her family for 4 decades. The air in the basement reeked of moldy paper, rusted metal, and a thick silence broken only by the slow hum of a ceiling fan. She sifted through the catalog, pulling open iron drawers, flipping through faded files, and slowly noticed a disturbing pattern from 1960 to 1990. At least 17 ranchers had vanished, all living on the edge of the Superstition. Initial reports detailed starving livestock, empty ranches, and even cases where their young children were never found. Elena's hands trembled as she saw on land maps that each missing name was tied to plots with rare water sources or near canyons known for rich minerals. That couldn't be mere coincidence in a desert where every drop of water was as precious as gold. But what chilled Elena to the bone was that at the end of each file, instead of follow-up investigations, all were stamped in glaring red, "Case closed," often just weeks after the missing report was filed. No extended investigations, no explanations, no real search efforts recorded. It was as if everything was staged to end quickly, neatly, and push those names into oblivion. She kept scanning files, her eyes straining from tension, until she stopped at a yellowed page tucked inside a thicker file. At the top it read, "Missing, July 1977. Subject, Miguel Ortega. Elena's heart clenched. A scrawled note in blue ink read Rancher, Foreman. That was her grandfather, known to her only through a black and white photo in her grandmother's living room and vague stories of being taken by the desert. Now, his name stood starkly among 17 vanished ranchers, alongside others whose families had also been erased from Arizona's map. Elena turned the pages, finding a brief description, date of disappearance, not precisely determined, discovery, starving livestock, property not looted, presumed cause, harsh desert conditions. Not a single line mentioned possible foul play, no details of deeper investigation, just a swift conclusion. Case closed. She sank to the cold cement floor, files scattered around her, feeling both choked with rage and trembling. In the dim yellow basement light, Elena realized this wasn't just her family's isolated tragedy, but a systematic chain of disappearances, sealed in thick files, empty of truth. 17 ranchers, 17 families, 17 plots tied to water and minerals, gone from the map in mere weeks. And now, the stark evidence showed her grandfather wasn't swallowed by the desert as the papers claimed, but a victim of a buried conspiracy. Elena took a deep breath, resolve flaring within her, knowing she'd stepped onto a path with no turning back. To find who made Miguel and 16 other ranchers vanish, and why Pinal County chose silence. The Ortega barn lay deep in the arid land on the edge of the Superstition, where desert winds whistled through steep cliffs and swept sand over long-forgotten paths. Elena parked at the dusty entrance, staring at the barn's weathered wooden door hanging loosely on rusted hinges, gaping like the dark mouth of a giant tomb. The musty smell of decayed wood and long-dead livestock lingered, making her hold her breath as she stepped inside. Faint light from a small window revealed charred wooden beams, black soot streaking like scars from a fire hastily extinguished or deliberately doused to hide something. Elena swept her flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust-covered floor, and noticed long chain marks etched into the hard ground. The iron had rusted, but the shapes remained, as if this place once held something massive, perhaps livestock, perhaps people. She knelt, touching the cold, rough ground, feeling like she was brushing the wrinkled skin of a long-dead corpse. A sour, moldy stench mixed with something acrid rose from a dark corner, making her shudder. Stepping deeper, she brushed against a metal piece buried in rotted straw. She picked it up, recognizing a branding iron, its handle snapped, the iron head bearing a jagged O covered in red rust. But what stopped her heart for a moment was a dark, dried stain along the edge, hard like tar. Elena knew instantly it wasn't dirt, but blood hardened from 40 years ago. Her stomach churned, cold sweat beaded on her neck, yet instinct urged her forward. She pushed aside dry straw in a corner, the flashlight catching something jumbled in the dirt. Small white bone fragments, some still clinging to blackened cartilage. At first, she thought they were livestock bones, as this was once a ranch. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw a small rounded skull, too delicate for cattle or sheep. Elena choked, her trembling hands lifting a long bone, comparing it to basic biology knowledge, and a horrific realization hit. It was human, small enough to belong to a teenager or a petite woman. In that moment, the desert swallowed them, explanation crumbled like sand in the hot wind. Before Elena was no longer a folktale spun by rumor, but vivid evidence of a place that had been a scene of captivity, torture, and murder. She turned to the charred beams, the chain marks, the blood-stained branding iron, and the human bones mixed with livestock remains. They crashed into her with a truth her family had never dared voice. Miguel Ortega didn't vanish in the desert, as told. He may have been brought to this barn, held, tortured, and killed alongside other ranchers. Elena sank to the ground, still clutching the cold branding iron, her eyes burning with pain and resolve. She whispered into the barn's darkness, as if to her grandfather, "They killed you, but I'll find out why." And in the howling wind through the rotted door, the superstition seemed to echo back with the past resonance, promising a chilling journey still ahead. After leaving the barn with the smell of rusted iron still on her hands and haunting memories of human bones mixed with livestock, Elena knew her next step couldn't rely solely on files and the scene. She had to dig into her family's own memories. That afternoon, she drove to a small house on the outskirts of Phoenix, where her Aunt Rosa, Miguel's eldest daughter, had lived quietly for years. The house bore an old-fashioned air, its faded tile roof and front porch crowded with cacti and windows draped with heavy curtains, as if shutting out the world. Elena knocked, and when the door cracked open, Rosa appeared, weary, her silver hair tied back, eyes heavy but sharp with caution. "I'm here about Grandpa," Elena began, her voice low but firm. Rosa stood silent for a long moment, then nodded slightly, inviting her niece inside. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of stale coffee left on the stove and dusty old photos on the walls. The Ortega family in happier times, Miguel in a cowboy hat, hands on the shoulders of his daughters, Rosa and Elena's mother. Seeing those photos, Elena felt the room freeze with unspoken memories. They sat at a scratched wooden table. Rosa stayed quiet for a long time, twisting an old rosary as if gathering courage, then spoke. "Before he vanished, your grandfather complained about strangers coming to the ranch. They wore clean shirts, but had eyes cold as steel. They told us to sell the land, leave the Superstition, said we'd only die of thirst there. But your grandfather knew the groundwater running through that land was a treasure. He refused, and after that, the gang kept threatening." Elena listened silently, her heart racing as the pieces matched what she'd found in the barn. Rosa lowered her voice. "The night he disappeared, we heard gunshots. I still remember, around midnight, short bursts echoing from the ranch. Your mother covered her ears and cried, and I could only hold my little sister in the corner, trembling like a scared animal. We wanted to run out, but fear held us back. By morning the ranch was empty, and your grandfather never came back." Elena choked up, picturing her grandfather facing those gunmen in the dark. "What about the police?" she asked. Rosa's face hardened. "They came fast, almost too fast. Not to investigate, but to settle things. A sheriff walked in, slapped a paper on the table, told your mother to sign. They called it a land release, said, if we signed, everything would be fine. But if not," she paused, her voice shaking. "They named every person in our family. They said we could vanish like your grandfather." Your mother was trembling as she signed, tears falling on the paper. "And from then on, we didn't dare say a word." Elena's hands clenched until her knuckles whitened. Rosa's story aligned perfectly with her suspicions. This wasn't the desert's punishment, but an organized plot. "Why didn't you ever tell my mom? Or anyone?" she asked, voice breaking. Rosa looked at her niece, her tired eyes clouded with sorrow. "Silence was the only way to survive, Elena. For years, we learned to swallow our grief, bury the memories with your grandfather. Those people didn't just take our land. They planted a fear that lasted a lifetime." She turned away, tears falling onto the wooden table, seeping into its cracks, as if merging with old memories. Elena sat frozen, the image of the blood-stained branding iron flashing in her mind. Now every detail formed a gruesome puzzle. A gang forcing land sales, gunshots in the night, police pressing for a land release. Miguel hadn't been swallowed by the desert. He'd been targeted, eliminated, and his family forced into silence. Elena placed her hand on the table, her voice firmer than ever. "Aunt, I can't stay silent anymore. I'll find the truth, for Grandpa, for everyone." Rosa looked at her, eyes mixing fear and hope. "You might wake the people we tried to forget, but if you're brave enough, at least let the world know your grandfather didn't fall quietly. He died fighting to keep land and water for our family." Elena nodded, her heart heavy but her eyes ablaze. She stood, stepping onto the porch where Arizona's scorching afternoon sun and swirling dust carried echoes of gunshots from 40 years ago. In that moment, Elena knew her journey wasn't just about finding truth for her grandfather, but a battle against a dark network binding the Superstition's memories. Elena left Rosa's house weighed down by her aunt's words, The story of gunshots in 1977 and the forced land release cutting like knives into memories she'd never witnessed but now felt vivid in every chilling detail. She knew to continue this journey, she needed to find the one person who was near the ranch that night and still alive today. Javier Ortega, Miguel's cousin, who once worked on the ranch. Rosa had mentioned his name hesitantly, as if speaking it might summon danger, but Elena was determined to track him down. After several calls, she learned Javier lived quietly in a small wooden house outside Globe, an hour's drive from the Superstition. The house stood isolated in a dusty landscape, its sagging tile roof and front yard littered with old farm tools. As Elena parked, a tall, lean man with white hair and a stooped back but sharp eyes stepped out. His face bore wrinkles like the cracked earth of the desert. "I'm Elena, Miguel Ortega's granddaughter," she said. Javier paused, then nodded, his eyes flickering with surprise and caution. "So you haven't let go of that ghost," he sighed, his voice rough from tobacco. Inside, the house smelled of stale cigarettes and decayed wood. The walls lined with faded family photos. Elena sat on a wooden chair, watching Javier pour 2 cups of thick black coffee. He stayed silent for a long time, as if wrestling between 40 years of silence and the urge to let go. Then he began, his voice slow but firm. "That night, your grandfather sent me to Phoenix to buy supplies. I drove the truck all night on the highway. When I returned at dawn, the ranch was nothing but emptiness." He paused, taking a drag on his cigarette, eyes staring through 4 decades. The pens were abandoned, the cattle screaming hoarse, and the barn was smoking. "I saw warm ashes inside. The smell of burnt wood mixed with burnt flesh nearly knocked me over. But there was no one. They were gone, like they never existed." Elena gripped her coffee cup, hanging on every word. "Did you report it to the police?" she asked. Javier nodded, his eyes flashing with bitterness. "I did, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. I ran to the station, told them what I saw. The sheriff looked me in the eye and said something that froze my blood. 'If you want to join those ashes, keep asking.' After that, 2 strange men followed me for weeks, standing outside my house every night. I knew if I spoke again, my whole family would be dead, so I stayed silent. Silent for 40 years. Javier's voice trembled, his hand holding the cigarette shaking slightly. Elena's eyes blurred, not just from sympathy, but from rage at the buried truth. "Why tell me now?" she asked. Javier was quiet for a moment, then stood, walked to an old bedroom, and returned with a worn leather notebook, its pages frayed. He placed it on the table, his hands trembling but his eyes steady. "I knew one day someone in the family would rise to find the truth. I wrote down everything, every detail, every name I heard from the threats, from the shadows coming and going in the night. This is the only thing I kept, despite the fear. Now, you should take it." Elena opened the notebook, its pages revealing scrawled lines heavy with meaning, specific dates, descriptions of strange trucks parked near the ranch, men in clean cowboy clothes with rough voices, even details of a groundwater map they mentioned, while threatening Miguel. Some pages recorded brief dialogues, like "sell the land," or "let your bones fertilize the desert." Elena read, her skin prickling. Javier looked at his niece, his aged eyes blending guilt and relief. "All my life, I regretted not being there that night, regretted not protecting Miguel, but maybe because I was gone, I survived to keep what I saw. Now, I pass it to you. Do what I didn't dare." Elena closed the notebook, clutching it to her chest, feeling the weight of 40 years of silence in her hands. A mix of anger and resolve surged within her. She knew she held a crucial piece, a living witness, and a notebook of undeniable evidence that Miguel's and other ranchers' disappearances weren't the desert's doing, but human hands. As she left Javier's wooden house, Arizona's sun blazed overhead, but Elena felt a chill to her bones. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but silence was no longer an option. Elena returned from Javier's wooden house with the old leather notebook pressed tightly in her bag, feeling like she carried a heart pounding with 40 years of silenced truth. That night, in a small motel room in Apache Junction, she spread the notebook on the table under a dim yellow light, flipping through its pages for clues. Javier had repeatedly noted names and dates, particularly mentioning that after a rancher vanished, their land was quickly transferred to a company with a cold name, Desert Holdings, LLC. Elena cross-referenced this with the files she'd copied from the Pinal County archives, noticing a chilling pattern. Nearly all the land with groundwater or near mineral-rich canyons ended up with this company after the disappearances. There was no coincidence here. It seemed the ranchers' vanishings paved the way for a swift, silent chain of land deals. The next day, Elena visited the land records office in Florence, the seat of Pinal County. A low, weathered building with dusty, frosted glass windows. She presented her local press ID to request access to land records. The elderly clerk grumbled, impatient, but after a few service fees and Elena's determined stare, thick stacks of paper files were placed on the table. She sat for hours, flipping through pages, the musty smell of old paper stinging her nose, sweat soaking her shirt. And then, the name Desert Holdings LLC appeared repeatedly, like a haunting specter. On the transfer deeds, the legal signatory was none other than Sheriff Harold B. Connolly, Pinal County Sheriff in 1977, the year Miguel Ortega vanished. Elena paused for a long moment, staring at his scrawled signature, stamped with the sheriff's bold red seal. Her throat went dry. A sheriff, meant to protect the people, was legitimizing this blood-soaked land transfer. Elena jotted down Connolly's name and immediately searched old records at the Phoenix Library. There, among yellowed newspaper pages, she found fragmented lines that made her heart race. Harold B. Connolly had been mentioned in a federal investigation into a Mexico-linked drug trafficking ring in the 1980s. Though never formally convicted, his name appeared in multiple reports tied to rumors of massive cash exchanges in the dead of night. Elena slammed the newspaper shut, feeling the desert's heat flood her lungs. The pieces fit. A local gang couldn't cover up decades of disappearances alone, but a sheriff with county-wide power, linked to drug traffickers, could. In Javier's notebook, scattered notes now made sense. Sheriff came to Miguel's house. Talked to 3 strangers. That night, Miguel vanished. He hadn't dared write more, out of fear, but Elena could now read the implication. Harold Connolly didn't just turn a blind eye to the gang. He might have been part of the plan, protecting their actions, then using his signature to legalize the land deals after blood was spilled. Elena sat silently in the library. Old news clippings spread before her, her notebook filled with scribbled connections. She pictured Javier's weary face as he handed her the notebook, and Rosa's silent tears recounting the night gunshots echoed from the ranch. It formed a dark picture, not just a land-hungry gang, but a system of complicit officials, from the sheriff to land offices, all colluding to seize water and mineral resources. She left the library as the fiery afternoon sun swept across the Superstition Mountains, desert winds scattering the notes she'd hastily tucked into her bag. Standing in the shadow of the mountains that had swallowed so many ranchers, Elena knew the truth was leading her into a far more dangerous maze than she'd imagined. If Harold Connolly was involved, this wasn't just about a thuggish gang. It stretched into the heart of the county's power structure, and that meant anyone who touched the truth, including her, would be seen as a threat to eliminate. In her mind, one question echoed relentlessly. Had the silence of so many families, including her own, come from knowing the powerful weren't on their side, but were the ones signing papers that turned them into victims? At that moment, Elena understood her journey had grown beyond seeking justice for Miguel. She was stepping into a confrontation with a network of power and blood, one that had thrived in silence for nearly half a century under the Superstition's scorching sun. The flashlight's beam cut thin slices through the darkness as Javier led Elena deep into the Superstition Mountains. The narrow trail, littered with jagged rocks and dried snake bones, crunched underfoot like a warning. "You have to promise what you see here doesn't leave until we have solid proof," Javier whispered, his voice blending with the wind hissing through the canyon. Elena nodded, her heart pounding. After all she'd uncovered about Sheriff Connolly and Desert Holdings, she trusted Javier's claim that secrets remained buried in the mountains. They stopped before a sheer cliff, where a gray slab of cement jutted unnaturally from the red sandstone. The cement was cracked, green with moss, and stained with rust, as if metal had been buried within. "This is it," Javier said, his trembling hand touching the slab. "They sealed this cave in the late 70s. I saw trucks hauling cement and strangers guarding this spot. But afterward, it all vanished. Just a patched-up cliff like a wound that never healed." Elena swept her flashlight along the wall. Jagged drill marks remained, proof of a natural cave forcibly sealed by human hands. Javier pulled an old sledgehammer from his backpack, breathing heavily. "I've waited 40 years to have the courage to come back. Today, I think it's time." The sound of metal striking cement echoed in the dry desert air, chunks falling as dust clouded up, making Elena cough. After nearly an hour, a hole just wide enough to crawl through appeared, a musty, rotting smell wafting out like the breath of a torn-open grave. Elena ducked through with Javier, her flashlight piercing the thick darkness inside. The sight made her choke. On the cold, damp ground, piles of livestock bones lay heaped, horns and ribs broken and tangled with rusted, warped metal barrels. Some barrels were split, revealing a white, crusted powder like crystallized salt. "Preservatives or mining chemicals," Javier muttered, eyes fixed on the barrels. Elena knelt, her trembling hand picking up a small bone. It wasn't livestock. Its delicate, rounded shape was unmistakably a human hand bone. They swept their lights around the cave. In a dark corner, a pile of branding irons lay jumbled, their steel rusted red but still recognizable. Elena stepped closer, her eyes widening as she saw many irons stained with dark brown, hardened like blood dried for decades. One larger iron stood out, etched with a curved mitt. Javier's grip tightened. "I know that mark. It doesn't belong to any ranch around here. It's the mark of a Mexican gang, branding to claim control. When you saw this M, it meant the land was theirs." Elena swallowed hard, the cave's thick air choking her chest. "You're saying a Mexican gang was behind it all?" Javier shook his head. "Only part of it. They carried out the violence. But to build a network from land grabs to bribing officials, you need a bigger force. Connolly's signature you found is the key. But these livestock carcasses, these human bones in this cave, they're the rawest proof. No one vanished because of the desert. They were killed and dumped here like garbage." They ventured deeper, each step crunched on scattered bone fragments. Elena's light hit the cave wall, her heart clenching as she saw black burn marks, handprints, etched as if someone had clawed the stone before dying. Nearby, faintly visible, was an M branded into the rock, a sign of brutal execution, as if the victims were marked to intimidate. Elena turned to Javier, her voice breaking. "Could Miguel be in here?" Javier looked down, silent. He didn't answer, but his grim eyes said enough. This cave held not just the truth of missing ranchers, but the burial of a generation. People turned to dust for greed's sake. As they emerged, the desert's red sunset bathed the Superstition like an open wound. Elena took a deep breath, one thought echoing. If this was just one cave, how many other cement graves hid in these mountains? And if the MAM branding iron marked a Mexican gang, who was really pulling their strings? The answer lay somewhere in the Superstition's deadly silence, and she knew she'd gone too far to turn back. That night, Elena rented a small room at a roadside motel in Apache Junction, at the foot of the Superstition. The neon sign's red glow flickered through the dusty window. She sat at an old wooden table, spreading out photocopied land records, cave photos, and Javier's worn notebook. Her heart still reeled from the sight of white bones, blood-rusted branding irons, and the M etched on the cave wall. Elena felt it clearly. She'd poked a hornet's nest untouched for 40 years. As the clock neared midnight, she stepped outside for air. The desert's dry heat lingered, despite the cooler night. About to return, her eyes caught something in the empty parking lot. An old silver pickup, its paint peeling, sat a few dozen meters away, headlights off, but engine idling with faint smoke. Elena blinked, her heart skipping. Earlier, leaving the cave with Javier, she'd glimpsed this truck among others on Highway 60. Thinking it a coincidence, she'd ignored it. But now, it loomed outside her motel. She crept back inside, turned off the room's light, and peered through the curtain. In the dark, she saw clearer. A figure sat in the cab, motionless, occasionally raising something to their eyes. Elena held her breath. Under the faint moonlight, a glint revealed it was binoculars. They were watching the motel, watching her. She backed away, heart racing. Her trembling hand dialed Javier. Minutes later, urgent knocks sounded. "Elena, open the door. It's me," she exhaled, flinging it open. Javier stepped in, his face etched with tension. He pulled the curtain, glanced out, and clenched his jaw. "I told you, they're still here." Just like back then, he recounted how, after Miguel's disappearance in 1977, he'd been tailed by an unmarked pickup, silently following, blocking roads, then vanishing, as if it never existed. "They wanted to remind me, we see you, and if you talk, you'll disappear like Miguel." Javier turned to Elena, his voice low. "Now it's your turn, Elena. They know you're digging up what should have stayed buried." Elena swallowed hard, recalling the shadow vanishing behind trees in the empty lot. Trembling, she asked, "If they're still here after all these years, does that mean the whole network is still active?" Javier nodded, eyes distant. Desert Holdings is just a shell. Behind it are the Mexican gang, corrupt officials, and new players replacing the old. They never left the Superstition. They just wait for the curious to wander in and get swallowed. The truck's engine roared in the dark, a challenge. Elena rushed to the window, but it had swerved and vanished down the dusty road, leaving silence. She knew this wasn't the end, but the opening of a hunt. Turning to Javier, her voice broke. "So, what do we do?" Javier took a deep breath, pulling a small worn leather pouch from his coat and placing it on the table. "This has a map of spots I saw trucks gather in the mountains. I stayed silent for 40 years, but no more. If you're in, I'm with you. But Elena," he locked eyes with her, his gaze heavy with dread. "Be ready. From this moment, every step could lead to death. Like Miguel, like all the ranchers who vanished. They were erased, and now they'll do the same to you, if you slip." Elena nodded, gripping her trembling hand. Fear, pain, and rage fused into one. The Superstition's darkness outside seemed thicker, as if the ancient mountains swallowed both secrets and those daring to expose them. But this time, she vowed, the silence wouldn't last another 40 years. At dawn, Elena sat in the small motel room, surrounded by Javier's old files. The acrid smell of last night's cold coffee hung heavy, adding to the oppressive air. She opened the leather pouch. Javier left, revealing yellowed, frayed papers clipped with rusted pins. A large, folded geological map lay neatly inside. Unfurling it, Elena froze. It was a map of the Superstition, with blue lines snaking underground. Not a typical ranch map, but a diagram of groundwater veins. The blue lines were clearly marked, flowing through lands owned by the 17 ranchers who vanished from the 1960s to 1990s. Elena traced her finger along the markings. Miguel Ortega's name sat atop a major vein crossing a canyon. Nearby were names from the Pinal County missing files: Caldwell, Henderson, Ramirez, all matching key groundwater sites. She exhaled, feeling a dark web emerge from the dust. These ranchers didn't vanish randomly. They were targeted for water, the desert's most precious asset. Javier sat across the table, nodding silently. "I suspected it for years. Back then, gangs knocked on every ranch, pressuring sales. Those who resisted vanished. Those who gave in left quietly. These groundwater veins were the reason. Without them, the Superstition couldn't sustain cattle." He pointed to a map corner, stamped "Confidential, Bureau of Land Management." Elena shuddered. "This is federal." Javier sighed, his aged eyes bitter. "Yes, The government knew where the water was, but instead of protecting ranchers, they stayed silent. Some officials likely looked the other way, or helped. How else did Desert Holdings seize land so fast and clean? Elena snapped photos of each page, torn between shock and fury. The truth was clear. Since the 70s, federal authorities knew Superstition ranchers were being preyed on, but files were sealed, the confidential stamp a shield burying the truth for 4 decades. They knew and did nothing, Elena whispered, bitterness choking her throat. In that moment, she recalled her aunt signing the land release under gunpoint and realized her family was just a pawn in a much larger game. Outside, dawn light bathed the desert, golden rays hitting the Superstition's red rocks. Beautiful, yet deceptive. Beneath that beauty, ranchers' blood had soaked the earth into the very groundwater now claimed by corporations and gangs. Javier stressed, "You see it now. They didn't just want land. They wanted control of the water. Whoever holds water rules the desert." Elena folded the map, gripping it tightly. A steely resolve echoed within. This time, the secret wouldn't stay sealed like the cement-blocked cave. But fear crept in. If the government was involved, was anyone safe as she dug deeper? Elena looked at Javier, his eyes both resolute and weary. "They're still here," he repeated from the night before. "Not just the men in the truck watching the motel, but bigger names higher up. They've been silent for 40 years and will kill again to keep it that way." Elena took a deep breath. The photos, files, groundwater map, all pieced together a horrifying picture. A picture where Miguel Ortega's death was just one fragment in a far larger scheme. And she knew, from now on, every step in the Superstition was watched from the shadows. Elena left the motel at noon, the sun hanging over the Superstition, its rays scorching the cracked earth like fire. In her bag, the groundwater map she'd photographed from Javier's documents weighed heavily, not just for the Ortega family, but for dozens of ranchers vanished over 3 decades. She decided to return to Phoenix's public archives to trace the land's fates after changing hands. On the old microfilm screen, land ownership reports scrolled by. The deeper she read, the colder her heart grew. Every vanished ranch, Ortega, Henderson, Ramirez, Caldwell, transferred to one name, Desert Holdings LLC. Elena noted carefully, in 1977, right after her family disappeared, the Ortega file was signed over to Desert Holdings. In 1980, the Caldwell Ranch. In 1984, Henderson's land. A perfect pattern. Rancher vanished, land becomes unclaimed within weeks. Files stamped case closed, property transferred to Desert Holdings. The coincidence was too stark to be random. She dug into business records. Desert Holdings was registered to a small office in Mesa, but when Elena checked, it was just an empty storefront with a faded sign. Neighbors gave vague answers. They just had a mailbox. No one worked there. But in legal filings, Desert Holdings owner was a familiar name from 1980s Arizona politics, Senator Harold Kinsey. Elena sat frozen at the computer. Kinsey, a prominent figure from a wealthy Tucson family, was known for infrastructure projects. In old papers, he smiled brightly, promising to bring Arizona into a new era of desert prosperity. But land records told another story. Kinsey, through Desert Holdings, had acquired all the vanished ranchers' lands. Elena uncovered a chilling detail. In 1982, 5 years after the Ortega disappearance, Kinsey unveiled a massive reservoir on land, once owned by 2 ranchers, swallowed by the desert. Hailed as an engineering marvel, it supplied water to Phoenix's booming population. But Javier's groundwater map showed it sat at the intersection of the Superstition's 2 largest veins. Kinsey hadn't just taken land, he'd seized the region's lifeblood, turning it into political and economic capital. A 1983 article praised Kinsey. Thanks to the senator's vision, Arizona now has a strategic reservoir securing water for the future. No one mentioned Henderson or Ramirez, whose names once marked that land on maps. Their families vanished from history as if they'd never existed, while Kinsey was hailed as a hero. When Elena shared this with Javier, he was silent for a long time before saying, That's how the game's played, Elena. The gang did the dirty work. Threats, killings. Officials signed papers, turning ranchers' blood legal. Then they built monuments to themselves on that land. Elena gripped her notebook, rage barely contained. She recalled the blood-rusted branding irons in the cave, the gunshots her aunt heard in the night. All pointed to one truth. Kinsey had used the ranchers' disappearances to fuel his political rise, while her family and others were erased from the map. But a new question arose. If the Bureau of Land Management stamped confidential on the groundwater map, they knew what Kinsey and Desert Holdings were doing. Why the silence? Were they bribed, or were a few ranchers just necessary losses for the state's growth? Elena's spine chilled. She closed the files, her eyes burning in the fading library light. This game didn't stop at the Mexican gang or Sheriff Connolly. It reached to senators, maybe even Washington. And now, Elena Ortega was the only one reckless enough to lift the desert dust covering these crimes. Elena left the Phoenix Library at dusk, the last sunlight casting a fiery red veil over the dusty streets. She was still reeling from Harold Kinsey's tie to Desert Holdings and the 1982 reservoir. Questions swirled in her mind, but answers seemed ever out of reach. Stepping into the parking lot, she spotted an old man waiting by her weathered pickup. His thin frame was hunched, eyes hidden under a faded cowboy hat, but his gaze was sharp, as if he'd been watching her for a long time. "You're Ortega?" His voice was hoarse, trembling but firm. Elena nodded hesitantly, stepping back warily. The man pulled a rusted iron object from his coat pocket. The sunset's orange glow caught the familiar, warped O shape. Elena's heart skipped. It was the Ortega Ranch's branding iron, the mark Miguel once used on his cattle. The man spoke low, as if afraid the desert wind might hear. "I used to work for them. Back then, I was just a grunt, hauling cargo, burying bodies. I didn't know it'd go that far. But the night Ortega vanished, I was near the barn. I heard screams, gunshots. They told me to stay quiet, paid me dirty money. It's haunted me my whole life. Now, I don't have long left. You need the truth." He pressed the branding iron into Elena's hands, his eyes desperate. "This is proof." Miguel fought back, and they used his own branding iron to torture him, to warn others. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." Elena's trembling hands took it, the cold metal searing her palm like a burn. She opened her mouth to ask more, but he shook his head. "Don't look for me again. If they see me talking to you, I won't survive." That night, in her motel room, Elena stared at the O branding iron on the table. It wasn't just rusted metal, it was vivid proof. Her grandfather didn't vanish in the desert as papers claimed, but was tortured with the tool most familiar to his rancher life. The next morning, as Elena prepared to meet Javier, a local news broadcast on the motel's small TV froze her. The man from last night, identified as Samuel Sam Harlan, an Apache Junction resident, had been found dead on a grassy field. Cause: fall from a horse. The anchor read flatly, "Preliminary reports suggest Harlan, 78, may have suffered a heart attack while riding, leading to the accident. Pinal County Police confirm no signs of foul play. The case will be closed within the week." Elena gripped the remote, her face paling. A fall from a horse. Sam was frail, limping, gasping for breath when he spoke to her last night. How could he have climbed into a saddle and galloped across a field? The coincidence was too blatant. Javier, hearing the news, slammed his fist on the table. Just like before. Anyone who opens their mouth is an accident by morning. 10 times, 100 times, always an accident. Elena turned over the O branding iron, blood rushing to her face. Last night, Sam risked everything to hand it to her, and now he was dead, neatly erased from the story like a discarded pawn. Guilt surged within her. If she hadn't met him, Sam might still be alive for a few more days, weeks. But Javier placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "Don't blame yourself. He chose to pass on the evidence to atone. Now it's your turn to make it mean something. Don't let his death be in vain." Elena looked up, her eyes blazing with resolve, but deep inside, a cold fear churned. Sam had only spoken to her for minutes, and he was dead by dawn. Someone was watching her every move, knowing everyone she contacted. She recalled the pickup truck from last night, the figure with binoculars outside the motel window. Those eyes had never left, and now, Sam's death was a warning. The truth about the superstition wasn't just buried under sand, it was guarded by blood. Elena stared at the rusted branding iron, its warped O shape. In the glaring morning light, it glowed like a searing mark, reminding her that the road ahead offered no way back. The desert trail through Arizona stretched endlessly before them, nothing but red dust, gravel, and blistering sunlight pouring from the sky. Elena sat behind the wheel, trying to stay calm, while Javier, in the passenger seat, clutched the old notebook and the O branding iron in a cloth bag. They'd been silent since leaving Apache Junction, both lost in thoughts of Samuel Harlan's sudden death. Everything happened too fast, too cleanly, and they both knew they were being watched closer than ever. The battered pickup rattled violently as it climbed the rugged trail, dust coating the windshield. Suddenly, Javier leaned forward, squinting. "Elena, stop." She slammed the brakes, tires screeching on gravel. About 20 meters ahead, a black SUV blocked the path, its door ajar, sunlight glinting off metal, a rifle. Before Elena could react, two figures emerged from behind cactus patches, faces masked with bandanas, handguns gleaming. One of them growled, "The superstition's taken enough lives. You two aren't allowed to dig up more graves." Elena gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding like a war drum. Javier touched her arm lightly, his eyes alert but unafraid. "They're not here to negotiate," he whispered. The tallest figure stepped forward, aiming the gun at the windshield. "Drop all the files, the map, and get out of here. This is your last warning." Elena felt blood pulse in her temples. The warning sounded like a death sentence if they didn't comply. But Javier knew this game too well. He slowly opened the door, stepped out, hands raised but eyes icy. "I stayed silent for 40 years, he said loudly, his hoarse voice echoing. "Not anymore." With that, he pulled an old pistol from under his coat, aimed at the ground, and fired. The shot tore through the desert air, reverberating off distant cliffs. A flock of vultures startled, taking flight in droves. In that moment, the three men froze. The surprise broke their dominance. Elena didn't hesitate. She floored the gas, the pickup roaring, veering left, grinding through dry brush. Bullets whistled, shattering the rear window, shards flying like deadly diamonds. Javier fired 2 more warning shots, forcing the men to duck. The truck lurched wildly, bouncing over rocky terrain, then cleared a large ridge. But the impact was too much. A sharp crack sounded from the undercarriage, the engine coughing and stalling. Elena pumped the gas, but it was useless. The dashboard needle flickered. The pickup stopped dead in the desert. Its front wheels skewed, they'd escaped the gunfire. But their vehicle was now a useless hunk of metal. Elena panted, sweat streaming down her neck. Javier checked his clip, his aged eyes glinting with resolve. Behind them, the armed men didn't pursue immediately. They stood at a distance, watching, then retreated to the black SUV. One shouted after them, his voice carrying like the wind. "This is the only time you walk away alive. Keep poking the superstition, and the sand will swallow your corpses." The SUV roared to life. Red dust swirling, obscuring the desert. Elena slumped against the steering wheel, feeling like she'd just dodged the Reaper's scythe. But Javier was different. He stared at the fading dust, whispering as if to himself, "They showed themselves. That means they're scared. The truth will come out." Elena looked up, her eyes sparking through the terror. "Then, we don't back down. They want us to run scared. But if Sam died, if Miguel died, if so many ranchers died, we can't turn back." Javier nodded, leaning back, his hand gripping the pistol. "Right. But from now on, Elena, the game's changed. This isn't just about finding the truth anymore. It's about survival. In the desert's blood-red dusk, the broken pickup lay like a wounded beast. Elena and Javier knew the road ahead left no room for hesitation. Those who warned them weren't bluffing, and the superstition, with all its darkness and blood buried under sand, was just beginning to open its jaws for those daring to challenge it. In the reading room of an old Phoenix bank, Elena scrolled through yellowed microfilm reels, the acrid smell of burning plastic rising from the projector. After the ambush on the trail, she and Javier had abandoned the wrecked pickup and hitched a ride back to the city with an old friend of Javier's. They'd escaped death, but Elena knew it was time to strike where guns couldn't hide, numbers on paper. If land was stolen, if lives were erased, money was the red thread tying it all together. Before her, columns of financial data from the late 70s appeared. Compensation payments to ranchers' families were listed: $15,000 for Henderson, $20,000 for Ramirez, $18,500 for Ortega. The sums seemed like post-tragedy aid, but cross-referencing Pinal County records, Elena realized no family ever received a cent. The next transactions showed all the money funneled to a single anonymous account under Arizona Mineral Development Corp., a mining company registered in 1976. Elena held her breath, jotting down every detail. Families who lost everything, land, loved ones, livelihoods, were supposed to get meager compensation, but even that was stolen. It all flowed to a shell company. Javier, beside her, his eyes blazing.
Exactly as I said.
They killed, then robbed, even the compensation.
Nothing left but ashes.
But what stunned Elena was the signature on many transactions. On typewritten withdrawal forms, a sprawling signature stood out: Robert Callahan, Lieutenant Governor, State of Arizona, 1978. She stared, rage and disbelief surging. A lieutenant governor, a top state official, personally signed for compensation meant for victims' families. Elena printed copies and laid them beside her groundwater maps. The gruesome pieces fit: land seized by Desert Holdings, Kinsey's Reservoir, built on stolen water veins, and now compensation siphoned off by a mining company with the lieutenant governor's signature. This wasn't just a thug's plot or a few corrupt cops. It was a power network, from Mexican gangs to Arizona's highest officials, crushing ranchers who stood in their way. Elena turned to Javier, her voice breaking. Miguel, Sam Harlan, all 17 ranchers, they never had a chance. The government was in on it from the start. Javier gripped her hand, his eyes wet but resolute. You see it now. For 40 years, we weren't just fighting shadows in the Superstition, but the state capitol in Phoenix. But the truth is surfacing. With enough evidence, no one can silence it. Elena nodded, but a new fear rose. If the lieutenant governor was involved, he didn't act alone. Bigger names, maybe in Washington, profited from the Superstition's water and minerals. She packed the files, her eyes fixed on Callahan's signature like indelible blood. Outside the bank's window, dusk fell over the desert, painting the Superstition red like a bleeding wound. Elena knew, from now on, she wasn't just a reporter, nor just a granddaughter seeking family justice. She was becoming the one holding evidence that could shake Arizona, and that meant every gun, every shadow in the night, would be aimed at her. The dirt road led Elena and Javier deeper into the Superstition, like an old desert scar. After finding the bank records with Callahan's signature, they knew the conspiracy's proof wasn't just in numbers, but hidden in the abandoned ranches. There's one more place I never dared return to, Javier whispered, driving a borrowed truck. The night Ortega vanished, I saw flames flickering south. Years later, they said it was lightning burning a cattle shed, but I know it wasn't. The truck stopped before a dilapidated barn standing alone in cracked, barren land. Its tin roof had collapsed halfway, wooden beams crisscrossed with cracks, the desert wind whistling through like a moan. Elena took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Instantly, a sour, acrid smell hit her old blood, manure and decades of decayed wood. The grayed wooden floor was splotched with dark brown stains, stretching like shadowy handprints. She knelt, touching one, realizing it wasn't mere dampness. It was blood soaked into the grain, etched permanently. Javier pointed to the rafters. Thick, twisted ropes dangled, looped at the ends, not for humans, but for cattle. They used them to hang cows, Javier said hoarsely. But maybe something else too. Elena shuddered, imagining animals writhing in pain, blood dripping to the floor, or even ranchers executed like livestock here. Tracing the bloodstains to a corner, Elena tripped over a small, rusted yellow tin box, clattering across the floor. She picked it up, turning it over. Stunned, a Kodak 35mm film canister, common in the 70s. Her heart raced. She pried it open, finding a film roll, stiff and dusty. Someone photographed something and hid it here in a hurry, she said, eyes fixed on the roll. Back at the motel, Elena and Javier rushed the film to an old Mesa photo shop that still did manual developing. The elderly technician grumbled at the film's age, but after hours of care, grainy gray images emerged. When Elena held the first prints, her blood froze. The photo clearly showed the barn they'd just visited, a rancher's body sprawled on the ground, chest bloodied, eyes wide open as if never closed. But what choked Elena and Javier was the figure beside the corpse. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform, badge glinting on his chest. The face was blurry but unmistakable. Sheriff Connolly, Pinal County Sheriff in 1977, who forced Elena's aunt to sign the land release. Elena felt the room spin. No longer rumors or suspicions, this was direct evidence. The county sheriff was at the scene beside a murdered rancher's body, no sign he tried to help or investigate. Instead, he stood like a guard, complicit in an execution. Javier sat silently, his gnarled hands trembling as he held the photo. "Now you understand," he said. "Why the case is closed so fast. Why no one in town dared speak. Because the sheriff, the highest authority here, was part of the gang." Elena stared at the photo, her eyes burning with rage and resolve. The pieces from the bank, the groundwater map, the blood-stained branding iron now connected, not just land or money, but local authorities directly bloodied their hands with the ranchers' deaths. She gripped the photos, knowing they now held undeniable visual proof of the crime. Outside, the Superstition's wind howled, reminding Elena the journey was only entering a more dangerous phase. And the shadow of Sheriff Connolly, who survived and profited for 4 decades, was about to be dragged into the light. Elena sat motionless in the motel room, the freshly developed photos before her, a rancher's body slumped in blood, and Sheriff Connolly looming beside it like an overseer. The dim ceiling light couldn't dispel the chill. Her heart pounded, while Javier sat silent too long, his trembling hands clutching the photo as if it weighed a ton. Finally, he set it down, pulling a small whiskey bottle from his pocket. He took a long swig, then looked up, his eyes etched with wrinkles and haunts. "Elena," he rasped. "It's time I told you the truth. A truth I've carried for 40 years. Elena braced herself, sensing a storm about to break. Javier rested his arms on the table, eyes not on her but staring into the dark beyond the window. "The night Miguel vanished," he said slowly. "I didn't just go to Phoenix for supplies like I told you. They called me out, forced me to work for them. Connolly, Vance, and their Mexican crew. They took me to a barren field, where deep pits were already dug. Then they made me grab a shovel and dig more. I didn't understand, until the trucks rolled in." He paused, exhaling as if pushing back the memory, but his eyes blazed with images he couldn't erase. The doors opened, and they dragged out ranchers, bound, beaten, some already dead. I saw Miguel, your grandfather, his face bloodied, but eyes still open. He looked at me, Elena. That look, it's haunted me my whole life. He knew I was forced, but I still felt like I betrayed him. Elena covered her mouth, tears spilling. "Oh God." Javier pulled a worn leather notebook from his inner pocket, placing it on the table. "After that night, I started writing. Not to go public, but to keep the memory alive. Names of every rancher, the dates they vanished, and who gave the orders." He opened the notebook, its yellowed pages showing scrawled but clear writing. "Here, Miguel Ortega, July 23, 1977. Ordered by Sheriff Connolly, Henderson, November 5, 1975. Ordered by Vance, Ramirez, March 12, 1980. Ordered by Callahan. Elena shuddered. Callahan, the lieutenant governor, whose name she'd just seen in the bank records. Javier continued, his voice drifting into memory. I buried at least 10 ranchers. Every name here, every pit. I wrote it all down, so if someone brave enough came along, the truth wouldn't die. Elena flipped through the pages, her chest tightening as she read. Then her eyes stopped on a line, trembling so much she could barely read. Caleb Turner, August 14, 1982. Ordered by Harold Kinsey. Elena looked up, stunned. Turner? Caleb Turner? Javier nodded, his eyes sad but fierce. Yes, Caleb Turner, one of the last ranchers eliminated. He refused to sell his land, rejected the compensation money. Kinsey personally ordered it, because Turner's land sat on the biggest water vein. They couldn't let him live. Elena clutched her head. Turner, the name wasn't unfamiliar. In her memory, it tied to a prominent figure in current politics, Senator Richard Turner, one of Arizona's brightest stars in Congress. Her voice shook. Richard Turner, Caleb's son? Javier was silent, then slowly nodded. Yes, and now you see why we must be doubly careful. The son of a victim sits in Congress. The big question is, does he know how his father really vanished, or did he choose silence for power? The room sank into heavy silence. Elena felt like she'd opened a door darker than she'd ever imagined. Not only were ranchers killed for land, not only were the sheriff and lieutenant governor involved, but now a sitting Arizona politician elected to represent the people had a father among the victims. If this truth broke, it wouldn't just shake the superstition, but the entire state's political landscape. Javier bowed his head, his voice breaking. I stayed silent to survive. But every night, I see Miguel's eyes in the dark. Now, with the truth right here, I can't hide anymore. Elena, you have to bring it all to light. Not just for Miguel, but for Turner, Henderson, Ramirez, everyone. Elena placed her hand on the notebook, feeling it pulse like a heart still beating with the rhythm of buried lives. She looked at Javier, tears glistening but eyes ablaze. We'll do it, Javier, no matter the cost. Outside, the Superstition's wind roared through the cliffs, as if reminding her that these mountains had swallowed enough blood and secrets. But now, with Javier's confession, those secrets were cracking, revealing a truth that 40 years of blood and cement had hidden. The next morning, as scorching sunlight flooded Apache Junction, Elena stepped out of the motel to find a Pinal County patrol car waiting by the curb. The window rolled down, and a deputy stared coldly. The sheriff wants to see you, now. Elena glanced at Javier on the steps, their eyes locking in tense understanding. Javier nodded slightly, signaling, go, but be careful. The Pinal County Sheriff's Office sat in the heart of town, a red brick building with an American flag snapping in the hot wind. Elena stepped inside, the iron door clanging shut behind her like a lock. Sheriff Marlon Pierce sat behind a large wooden desk, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, his eyes sharp as knives, but heavy with the sorrow of someone who'd seen things he wished to forget. He didn't offer a handshake, only motioned for Elena to sit. Without preamble, he began, I know you're Ortega. And I know you're digging into what this town buried 40 years ago. Elena clutched Javier's notebook in her bag, keeping her voice steady. If you know, then you also know this isn't just about my family. It's about dozens of lives, ranchers killed, erased. I won't stop. Pierce stared, his eyes not hostile but heavy with suffocating worry. He pulled a thin envelope from his desk drawer and slid it toward her. Elena opened it. Inside were photos taken from a distance. Her and Javier at the abandoned barn, at the Mesa photo shop. Even the moment Javier handed her the notebook in the motel, the images were so clear they could only come from professional surveillance. Elena's spine chilled. You see, Pierce said, lowering his voice. Their eyes are everywhere, not just in the mountains, but in this office. In Phoenix. Even in Washington. He paused, his hands clenching until they whitened. I didn't call you here to threaten you. I called to warn you. If you keep going, it's not just you, but your old cousin, the last of the Ortegas. You'll all disappear. Just like Henderson, Ramirez, Turner. Elena leaned forward, her eyes flashing defiance. Sheriff Pierce, I've seen the evidence. I know Callahan signed for the compensation money. I know Kinsey built a reservoir on stolen land. And I have a photo of Connolly standing over a rancher's body. If you're telling me to stop, it means you're scared of this truth too. Pierce gave a dry laugh, laced with bitterness. Scared. You think I don't know what Connolly did? You think I haven't heard old folks whisper about the night Ortega vanished? I know it all. But Ortega, this isn't about a few bodies anymore. It's about the whole state. Those reservoirs, the water veins you're talking about, they're Arizona's lifeblood now. Whoever controls water, controls politics. If this truth tears open, you won't just face some Mexican gang or a long-dead corrupt sheriff. You'll face men in suits in Congress, men who hold the fate of millions. Elena fell silent. Pierce leaned in, his voice a whisper. I'm telling you this so you understand. You can't win. Even me, sitting in this chair, I have to stay quiet. I keep order, sign papers, smile at press conferences. Because if I resist, I'll be erased, and someone else will take this seat, keeping their mouth shut. They've done it for 40 years, and they'll do it for 40 more. A heavy silence settled over the room. Elena heard the clock ticking and the dry hum of the air conditioner. Finally, Pierce stood, walking to the window, overlooking the small street. My advice, Ortega, leave Arizona. Take your family, go as far as you can. If you keep going, the superstition sand won't just swallow your family, it'll swallow you too. Elena stood, her hand still on Javier's notebook, eyes locked on Pierce. Sheriff Pierce, I understand, you're scared. But I can't stay silent for another 40 years. People died. My grandfather died. Their blood can't be covered by cement and reservoirs. I'll find the truth, even if this whole state stands against me. Pierce turned, his face taut. A flicker of respect crossed his eyes, quickly buried by infinite weariness. He said nothing more, only nodded slightly, like a farewell. Elena walked out of the office, the iron door clanging shut behind her, his chilling words echoing in her ears. Not just me, but this entire state. And Elena understood her fight had moved beyond abandoned ranches. She was now facing an entire system, a darkness rooted deep in Arizona's veins. Elena left Sheriff Pierce's office, with a heavy heart but eyes still burning. His words, not just me, but this entire state, clung to her like a curse all the way back to the motel. She knew Pierce wasn't lying. Those controlling the superstition had roots so deep that even uniformed men stayed silent to survive. But that admission only fueled Elena's resolve. The evidence couldn't stay locked in Javier's notebook or faded Kodak photos. It had to see the light. That night, she stayed awake, compiling everything: photos of the barn with blood and ropes, the Kodak film showing Connolly bank records with Callahan's signature, the groundwater map stamped confidential. She assembled a digital file, paired with a 30-page investigative draft. Her hand trembled as she sent it, addressed to Channel 7 Phoenix, the state's biggest station, where she knew an editor, Maria Lopez, who'd backed sensitive investigations before. Maria called back instantly, voice thrilled. Elena, this is a ticking bomb. If it's all true, we'll air a special by the weekend. I'll protect this story. 2 days later, Elena and Javier went to Phoenix for a test shoot. In the editing room, Maria clapped Elena's shoulder, smiling optimistically. You're brave. This could change Arizona's history. The screen displayed the evidence, the O branding iron, Connolly, beside a rancher's body, and the bank receipt with Callahan's signature. Elena's heart raced for the first time in weeks. She believed justice was near. But the next day, as the broadcast loomed, Elena's phone buzzed relentlessly. On the line, Maria's voice shook. Urgent. Elena, I'm sorry. The program's canceled. Orders from above. They say it's not in the public's interest. Elena froze. Not in the public's interest? We have proof of murder, corruption, land theft. How? Maria cut her off, voice breaking. I can't say more. Leave Phoenix now. They know where you are. Before Elena could ask more, the line went dead. She switched on the TV, but instead of the promised exposé, Channel 7 aired a local sports show. It felt like the air was sucked from the room. Javier cursed, slamming the table. I warned you, they'll never let the truth out that easily. That night, a small news item appeared on the station's website. Investigative editor Maria Lopez announces resignation for personal reasons. One line, no photo, no thanks, no farewell. Elena read it repeatedly, her hands ice cold. Maria, who'd vowed to protect the story yesterday, was now erased from the media as if she'd never existed. Then Elena's inbox blinked. An email from an anonymous address, no subject, just one line. We've buried more than you think. Don't be next. Attached was an empty file. Elena understood. It wasn't information. It was a warning, a mind game. Proof. They were tracking her every move, knew who she'd sent files to, even knew she was alone in the dark motel room reading this. She closed the laptop, leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Pierce's words echoed, not just me, but this entire state. Now she knew, it wasn't just past sheriffs, Kinsey, or Callahan. Invisible hands gripped the media, the last voice of justice. Javier sat beside her, eyes grim. Elena, you see it now, they don't just kill people, they kill the truth. Elena bit her lip, tears rising, but eyes resolute. If they can choke a TV station, we'll find another way. As long as we have evidence, we have a chance. Outside the window, the Superstition's darkness stretched to Phoenix. But Elena knew the cat-and-mouse game had moved beyond the mountains, and the predators were closer than ever. Near midnight, Elena and Javier returned to the Ortega land, where only the ruins of a barn and charred wooden posts stood like a giant skeleton. After the bitter failure at the Phoenix station, Elena realized official channels were locked tight, and people like Maria Lopez would keep vanishing from the media without a trace. To find something undeniable, they had to go to the source, where blood was spilled, where secrets were buried. The Ortega barn was the starting point. Javier carried a rusted shovel, Elena a flashlight. They knelt on the cracked, dry ground, digging at a spot Javier remembered clearly. That year, before the barn burned, I saw them bury something here. A heavy wooden chest, took 3 men to carry. I didn't dare dig it up, knowing if they caught me, I'd be buried with it. But now, it's time. Each shovel thrust sank into stone-hard earth, the sound echoing in the desert night. Sweat soaked their shirts, dust caked their hands, but they didn't stop. After over an hour, Javier's shovel hit something solid. They frantically cleared dirt, revealing a wooden corner, rotted but intact. Elena's heart pounded as they hauled the chest from the pit. The wood was cracked, burn-marked, but its iron lock held. Javier pried it open with a crowbar. A sharp crack sounded, the lid flew open, dust billowing. Inside wasn't gold or silver, but papers. Leather-bound files, their edges yellowed, but the text still legible. Elena pulled out a stack, hands shaking. They were original rancher land contracts, signed under duress. Each bore familiar names, Henderson, Ramirez, Ortega, but the signatures were shaky, scrawled, as if signed at gunpoint. Below were water rights transfers, legalizing groundwater extraction, stamped with the county seal and Connolly's signature. Elena felt her blood boil, seeing the same hand that legalized every death. She flipped further and found a copper mine map spanning the Superstition's eastern slope. Red lines circling areas once owned by Turner and Caldwell. Copper, Javier muttered. It wasn't just water. This desert holds copper mines. They killed for both. At the chest's bottom was something that froze Elena. A typewritten list of ranchers, each name paired with a disappearance date. Beside them, signatures from a company, Southwest Development Inc. Elena looked closer, gasping. My God, this company, it's now Copper Sun Energy. a Fortune 500 listed on the New York Stock Exchange. According to financial records, Copper Sun was now hailed as a clean energy giant for mining and solar power in the Southwest desert. But in the Ortega barn's darkness, Elena and Javier held papers proving this Fortune 500's foundation was built on the blood of superstition ranchers. Elena photographed each page, hands trembling but eyes resolute. This is what they can't deny. No more rumors or memories. These are original files, buried on Ortega land. And now they're in our hands. Javier sank to the ground, his face wet with sweat and tears. Miguel, my brother, finally, the truth isn't buried anymore. He looked at Elena, voice breaking. But you must understand, Elena. When Copper Sun sees you have this, you'll be their #1 enemy. This isn't just a fight in Pinal County anymore. It's a war against a billion-dollar corporation. Elena closed the chest, her eyes blazing in the desert night. If they buried it here, they thought no one would dare dig it up. But things are different now. I won't let Miguel, Henderson, Ramirez, Turner be erased from history. If Copper Sun was built on blood, the world will know. Far off, the superstition's wind howled through the canyons like an ancient growl from a land that had seen too much blood and secrecy. In the dark, Elena gripped the rotted papers, feeling their weight heavier than stone, each page a life. And she knew, from this moment, the game had moved beyond Arizona. It reached the glass towers of New York, to those called clean energy giants, whose profits bore the stain of rancher blood. That night, Elena stayed awake like an owl. The rotted wooden chest weighed heavy in a cloth bag under the bed, while photos, maps, and contract copies sat neatly stacked on the table. The flashlight sweeping pages like probing unhealed wounds. The small motel room swayed under the hum of the ceiling fan, but its sound couldn't mask the thick silence. Both knew that since pulling the chest from the Ortega barn, everything had changed. Those with power, guns, and money were piecing together their defenses. Around 2 a.m., as Elena hunched over the table, eyes red from sleeplessness, a crash like a small thunderclap shook the room. An explosion, glass shattering, a flash of light. The room went dark, wind rushing in with the cold night sky. Elena screamed, diving to the floor. Glass cut her hand, blood seeping hot. Javier sprang up like a younger man, grabbing the pistol kept in the nightstand drawer for years, used to warn off night hunters. They rushed to the window. Outside, a car parked across from the motel was pulling away. Taillights flashing red, a shadowy figure jumped into the driver's seat and sped off in a dust cloud. On the carpet, bullet marks pierced the curtain, carving jagged patterns into the wallpaper. One bullet had torn through the old photo of Miguel, leaving a black hole in his face. A bone-deep chill hit. This wasn't a normal threat, but a clear message. They know we're here, and they're ready to shoot. They want to drive us from safety, Javier whispered, his frame trembling slightly. This isn't just a warning. They're showing they can kill your whole family. His voice was low, not dramatic, but heavy. He knelt, picking up the bullet-torn photo of Miguel, his eyes clouding, tears welling. I'm sorry I couldn't protect my brother, he said, a silent confession. Elena knelt beside him, her hand still bleeding. She pressed a dirty cloth to the wound, not for pain but to hold on to calm amid chaos. It's not your fault, Javier, she said, voice soft but firm. If you hadn't lived to tell, who would have kept this paper? Who would have remembered their names? She met his eyes, her gaze holding pain and steely resolve. You did right by hiding the evidence. And now, you're doing right by being here with me. A faint knock sounded at the door, not bold like a guest's, but cautious, ensuring someone was awake. They held their breath. Javier crept to the small foyer, peered through the peephole, then closed it silently. No one was there. Under the door, a sand-soaked paper was shoved through, crumpled, scrawled, "Stop, or die like the others." No signature, none needed. They knew who sent it. Elena crushed the paper, feeling decades of suppression burst in her hand. She thought of Rosa, sobbing as she recounted the story. Of Samuel Harlan, the old man who gave her the branding iron and fell from a horse by morning, of the shadows in the black SUV, Connolly in the photo, Callahan's signature, and Kinsey's name bold on paper. Each death, each document, a piece, each threat a reminder. Stay silent, they live on. Speak, they destroy you. Heavier leaned on the table, voice hoarse. They'll kill you too. They've done it before. They're not afraid of exposure, because they trust their power. Officials, lawyers, bought media. They can make evidence vanish. But one thing they can't control, the truth spreading if many know. He looked at Elena intently, as if passing his last strength. You have to scatter it. Don't keep it all in one place. Store copies in libraries, independent news, foreign accounts. Send to those who can't be bought. And if you can, release some publicly all at once. They can't silence every channel at once. Elena listened, each word drilling deep. Plans flashed through her mind. Upload files to foreign servers. Send hard copies to out-of-state investigative magazines. Give copies to independent lawyers. Store some in safe deposit boxes across cities and prepare a public release without mainstream media. Maria was silenced. They had to think smarter. She looked at Heavier, eyes red but fierce. If I stop, my grandfather dies again. If I speak, he lives. The words spilled out, defiant yet pleading, a forced paradox. Elena knew this wasn't romantic tragedy. It was duty. Giving up meant aiding a 40-year death. Fighting risked her life. She couldn't deny her heart. Heavier nodded, his eyes glistening. Then speak. Speak so the nation, the world hears. But be ready. They'll hit back. He stood, opening a small suitcase hidden under the bed. From it, he pulled a thick envelope, scanned copies of the chest's contents, stored on multiple USBs, 2 notarized paper sets, a list of encrypted email accounts. I prepared some things for the worst case, he said. I didn't dare hope much, but at least, we can make this voice harder to silence with one bullet. In that moment, in the small motel room, amid the fans' hum and broken glass, 2 generations waged a war with paper and courage. They split the evidence, Elena sending an encrypted package to a federal lawyer known for fighting corruption, uploading parts to foreign servers via VPN, and faxing hard copies to independent investigative newsrooms. Each action was an arrow into the dark. As they prepared to rest, Javier sat by the bed, hands trembling, clasped like in prayer. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder, gently. They'll try to kill us, but at least Miguel won't be forgotten. Outside, the Superstition stood silent, like an elder watching those daring to stir its earth. In Elena's heart, the bitter fire had become unshakable resolve. Tomorrow, she'd go public, not through one station, one channel. She'd make the truth spread so the powerful couldn't choke it all. And if that meant trading her life, she was ready to pay for her promise to Miguel. The next morning, Apache Junction's sky blazed like an omen. Early sun swept the Superstition Mountains, their red stone glowing, both beautiful and fierce. Outside the small town hall, a long line of national news vans crowded, antennas rising like a steel forest. Cameras were set, reporters jostled, mics bearing logos of major outlets, NBC, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post. All were drawn after Elena's press release and digital evidence package sent last night. News of a 40-year buried massacre exploded on social media, shaking the nation. Elena stood behind the hall's wooden door, heart pounding like a drum. On the table before her, evidence was meticulously arranged. Blood-stained rusted branding irons, Javier's notebook listing ranchers' names and disappearance dates. The confidential stamped groundwater map, land contracts with shaky rancher signatures, and Connolly's cold ones, Callahan signed transfers, and the Ortega chest files. Proof Copper Sun Energy was built on blood. Javier stood beside her, gripping a wooden cane, his aged eyes ablaze. It's time, Elena. Miguel will hear today. They all will. As the door opened, hundreds of cameras flashed. Elena stepped out, mics thrusting like spears. She placed the branding irons on the table, their heavy metal clank on wood, silencing the room. Then she began, voice clear. 40 years ago, they said the desert swallowed my family. They called the Superstition a place of ghosts, of accidents. But here's the truth. The desert didn't kill them. People did. She held up the notebook, reading aloud each rancher's name, disappearance date, and who ordered it, as Javier recorded. Each name cut through the silence like a knife. Henderson, Ramirez, Ortega, Turner. The room held its breath. Reporters scribbling every word. Elena opened the bank files, pointing to Connolly and Callahan's signatures. These are the hands that legalized blood. This is how compensation money went to a shell mining company. And this, she slammed the copper mine map on the table, is the real reason. Water and minerals. They killed to steal. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed on the O branding iron and the Kodak photo of Connolly, by a rancher's body. No room for denial. In the front row, gray-suited officials stood, faces bloodless Arizona's current officials, who'd blocked the press. But as Elena finished, the back doors burst open, and FBI agents stormed in. A voice rang out. The federal government is now involved. This is no longer a county case, but a federal crime involving systemic corruption and murder. The crowd of reporters froze. Agents moved to the officials' row, cuffing 3 on the spot, including a state senator and a former governor's aide. Cameras snapped wildly, flashes lighting the room. One official struggled, shouting, "You don't know what you're doing." But he was dragged out amid the chaos. Elena stood still, heart thundering. She saw Javier's face light up, eyes wet. He whispered, "Miguel," finally. A CNN reporter thrust a mic forward. "Miss Ortega, do you know what the public's calling this? They're using Superstition ranchers massacres nationwide. What do you think?" Elena took a deep breath, facing the cameras, voice firm. "They called it accidents. They called it disappearances. But it was a massacre. Yes, call it the Superstition ranchers massacre, so no one forgets. So every time these mountains are mentioned, people remember the ranchers' blood spilled here for the greed of the powerful." The hall erupted in noise, reporters clamoring with questions. But Elena was done. She stood silent, eyes on the Superstition mountains through the window. For the first time in 40 years, the darkness was torn open. Blood and land, branding irons and files, all laid bare before the nation. In that moment, Elena knew the road ahead remained perilous. Copper Sun Energy wouldn't go down quietly, but at least, the truth was no longer buried under cement. And from today, America would know a new name etched in history, the Superstition Ranchers Massacre. Late afternoon, as the day's final light bathed the Superstition in blazing bronze, Apache Junction stood hushed before a newly unveiled memorial at the mountain's edge. A black granite slab bore 30 ranchers' names, no longer ghosts swallowed by the desert, but people named, remembered as victims of a cold-blooded plot. Desert wildflowers were placed in bunches around the stone, mixed with old cowboy hats and rusted branding irons kept by families for decades. Justice was finally written in black and white. After trials lasting over a year, at least 12 Arizona officials, including former Sheriff Connolly, a former state senator, and 3 land board members, received sentences from 20 years to life. Desert Holdings LLC, the shell company behind countless deals, was proven to be a front for Copper Sun Energy. Several top executives of the Fortune 500 faced federal probes and resigned. The Mexican gang that terrorized the Superstition's fringes was dismantled. Many arrested, others fleeing Arizona like ghosts abandoning a blood-soaked empire. The media called it one of the largest corruption and land crime cases in state history. Victims were honored in an Arizona state legislature resolution, and the story became a case study in journalism and law schools nationwide. Elena Ortega, the granddaughter who once stood silent by a rotting barn, won a Pulitzer for her exposé The Blood Under the Desert. The book not only told the Superstition's truth, but relived the pain, silence, and price paid by rancher families. She recounted motel nights with shattered windows, days when exposés were silenced, and the life-or-death choice to go public. "I didn't write to win awards," Elena said at the New York ceremony. "I wrote so my grandfather Miguel Ortega and the other ranchers wouldn't be buried under desert sand another day." Javier Ortega, the last living witness, was hailed by the community as the memory keeper. At the memorial ceremony, he stood by the stone, trembling hands placing a wildflower bouquet. "Huiti dud, with secrets. I thought I'd take to my grave," he told the crowd. "But thanks to Elena, the truth is out. And I, at last, can rest in peace." A week later, the town held a separate ceremony awarding Javier Pinal County's honorary citizen medal. The story closed with justice, but as with lands cursed by greed, justice only opened more doors. One winter morning, returning to her Tucson home after a long trip, Elena found a brown envelope at her doorstep, no sender's name. Inside was a folded aged paper and a hand-drawn map. It marked Nevada's desert, dotted with red points, each labeled with a rancher's name. Below, a scrawled line, "The superstition was just the start. If you're brave enough, Nevada waits." Elena sat motionless for a long time, hearing the wind whistle through the door, recalling Javier's blazing eyes at the memorial, his words, "Miguel will hear today." Now she knew her grandfather, and all the fallen ranchers, didn't die just for a stone marker. They'd started a larger journey, exposing a network deeper than she'd imagined. At the superstition's base, the memorial stood firm, a vow to the past. But somewhere in Nevada, other abandoned ranches might hide more blood-soaked secrets. The superstition closed one chapter, but Elena Ortega knew her quest for truth had only begun. The Superstition Ranchers Massacre story recalls a very American truth today. Justice doesn't appear on its own. It must be unearthed from public records, independent journalism, and community persistence. Elena only opened the first door by cross-referencing the confidential BLM groundwater map with Pinal County land records, realizing water-rich ranches fell to desert holdings and linked to Copper Sun Energy. The practical lesson: use legal tools, a FOIA, land registries, county recorder files, to verify accident stories, especially when land, water, or minerals are at stake. When Elena's exposé was canceled last minute by the Phoenix station and editor Maria Lopez suddenly resigned, we see the risk of media capture. Thus, citizens should diversify information channels, independent investigative outlets, nonprofits, digital archives, backup evidence, like Elena's hard copies, digital files, safe deposit boxes, and out-of-state servers, and find clean institutional allies. The FBI stepped in with federal grounds, state attorneys general, internal inspectors. The motel threats, blood-stained branding irons in the barn, the photo of Sheriff Connolly by a rancher's body, Callahan's signature on compensation records, all remind us that corruption often pairs with violence. Thus, safety is paramount. Risk assessment protocols, legal counsel, pre-announcing releases to multiple outlets to prevent total suppression. Communities also need healing rituals. The Superstition's memorial and Javier's honoring strengthen collective memory and prevent history being rewritten. Finally, when Elena received the Nevada victim map, it's a reminder of the issue's federal scope. Vote for representatives committed to resource transparency, whistleblower protection, and local citizen oversight groups. Justice, in America today, starts with questioning, documenting, and standing together. If you believe the truth of the Superstition Ranchers Massacre must never be buried, hit subscribe to join us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where more of America's secrets will be uncovered.